The owl appeared on a Tuesday, which meant nothing to anyone except Mira. She was 8 years old and standing at her bedroom window in the gray hour before sunrise. The hour her mother used to call the quiet time, when Myra first saw it perched on the fence post at the edge of the field. A barred owl, large and perfectly still, its brown-streaked chest facing the house, as though it had been waiting there all night and had simply decided at some point to be seen. Myra pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and watched it, and the owl watched her back. And for reasons she could not explain to anyone who was not 8 years old and had not lost their mother 2 years ago, she felt something move through her chest that was not quite fear and not quite sadness, but was something that sat between those two things like a stone. She called for her father 3 times before he came. Callaway Marsh was 41 years old and had been awake since 4 in the morning worrying about the irrigation line on the south field. Because the south field was his problem, the way everything was his problem now, the way the whole farm had become his problem the day Leanne died. And when he came to Myra's doorway with his coffee mug and his worn expression and saw his daughter standing at the window with her hand pressed to the glass, he felt a flash of something he recognized as tenderness, followed immediately by the particular exhaustion of a man who has too much to do and not enough hours. He looked at the owl. The owl looked at him. It was just a bird. But Mira turned from the window and said, with the calm certainty of someone stating a fact that had already been confirmed, that the owl was warning them, that it had been warning them since it arrived, that something was going to happen, and they needed to be careful. Callaway told her to go back to bed. This was the first mistake he made, and it would not be the last. There is a particular kind of grief that reshapes a person not all at once, but slowly, the way water reshapes stone, wearing away at the edges, until what remains is still recognizable, but also not quite the same as what it was before. Callaway had been living inside that kind of grief for 2 years by the time the owl appeared, and what it had done to him, among other things, was make him suspicious of anything that felt like meaning, because meaning was the thing that had failed him most completely when Leanne died. He had looked for meaning in the accident, in the timing, in the particular Tuesday afternoon in March, when a truck had crossed the center line on the County Road 3, miles from their house. He had looked for a pattern or a reason, or at least an explanation that would make the loss fit inside something larger than pure randomness. And he had found nothing, and the nothing had calcified inside him into a kind of stubborn rationalism that read as hardness to people who did not know him well, and as grief to the few people who did. He loved Mira the way you love the only thing left that matters. But he did not know how to talk to her about the owl, because the owl meant something to her that he could not afford to let it mean to him. What he did not realize yet was how much this distinction would cost him. The farm sat in a valley in the western part of the county, a wide, shallow bowl ringed by hills that channeled wind and rain toward the center in ways that the older locals had understood for generations, and that the newer weather models were only beginning to map accurately. Callaway had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his, and the valley had its own particular logic about weather that he had grown up understanding without ever articulating, the way a person understands their mother tongue without being able to explain its grammar. The valley caught storms. That was the phrase the old-timers used. It did not just receive them. It caught them, held them, concentrated them the way a lens concentrates light. The regional forecast for that week mentioned the possibility of a significant storm system moving through the area by Thursday. It mentioned it in the way that forecasts mention things when they are not yet sure, using words like possible and up to and localized areas, the kind of language that sounds like caution and functions as permission to ignore. Callaway had seen the forecast. He had noted it and moved on. What he had not seen was the forecast from the Emergency Management Office 3 counties over, which used different language entirely. Mira told her grandmother about the owl at breakfast. Edna Marsh was 67 years old and had lived in the valley her entire life and had, in that time, developed the unshakable conviction that children and animals perceive the world more accurately than adults. A conviction she had arrived at, not through any philosophy, but through decades of small accumulated observations that she had never written down but had never forgotten. She listened to Myra describe the owl, its size, its stillness, the way it had looked directly at the house rather than at the field, the way owls looking for prey are supposed to look. And Edna set down her coffee cup and asked one question. She asked how many mornings Mira had seen it. Mira said 4. Edna was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking rather than when she had nothing to say. Then she asked whether the owl came in the daytime or only at night, and Myra said both, daytime too, and Edna's expression changed in a way that Mira noticed, and Calloway, sitting at the other end of the table with his farm accounts open in front of him, did not. Barred owls are nocturnal. They do not, in general, perch in visible daylight positions for extended periods. When they do, it is occasionally attributed to territory defense, occasionally to food scarcity, occasionally to illness, and occasionally to nothing that ornithologists have been able to satisfactorily explain. What Edna knew about owls, specifically, was less than what she knew about the valley. But what she knew about the valley was that when the old things that lived in it started behaving strangely, the valley was usually about to do something. She said nothing of this to Calloway, because Calloway would not want to hear it. She did, however, quietly take her emergency kit out of the hall closet and check the batteries in the flashlights. By Wednesday morning, the owl had moved. This was what alarmed Mira most. Not that the owl was still there, but that it had changed position overnight. It had been on the south fence post since the first morning. Now it was on the north side of the property, on the wooden gate post that marked the beginning of the path down to the lower field. And it was facing north with the same still attention it had previously directed at the house, as though something to the north had now become the thing that required watching. Myra walked to the gate post after breakfast, slowly, the way she had learned to approach things she did not want to frighten away. She stopped about 4 feet from the owl, and the owl did not move. It was close enough that she could see the dark rings around its eyes, the way its feathers layered over each other with a neatness that seemed almost deliberate, the slight rise and fall of its chest. It turned its head and looked at her with one amber eye, and then turned it back to the north. She looked north. The sky was ordinary, pale and clear and unremarkable in the way that skies in October are sometimes clear before they are not, that particular brittle clarity that the valley sometimes showed the day before it caught something. Mira went back inside and told her father that the owl had moved to the north gate. Calloway was on the phone with the equipment supplier. He held up one finger to indicate that he needed a minute, and the minute became 5. And by the time he was done, the detail about the north gate had been set aside under the accumulated weight of the morning's other concerns. He asked Myra what she wanted for lunch. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read. Then she said it didn't matter and went upstairs. What she did not tell him, because she had tried twice already, and twice he had not understood, was that the owl was not just watching the north. It was watching the space below the north ridge, specifically the low place where the path narrowed between 2 hills and where, if you were coming up from the lower field and the weather changed fast, you could find yourself in a very particular kind of trouble. She knew this because her mother had told her about it once, on a walk, pointing at that exact gap and saying in the careful tone that mothers use when they want something remembered, "That's the place we never go when the sky does something strange." You remember that. Myra had remembered it. She was not yet sure that remembering it was going to be enough. The emergency alert went out at 6:47 on Wednesday evening. Not the mild advisory that had been circulating since Monday. Something different. A severe thunderstorm warning upgraded to a tornado watch for the eastern and central parts of the county, with an addendum that the National Weather Service had identified atmospheric conditions consistent with rapid intensification, meaning the storm system that had been described all week in careful, hedging language was now being described in language that did not hedge. Calloway saw it on his phone at 7:02. Between checking the grain storage levels and returning a message from his neighbor 2 miles east. He read it. He put the phone down. He looked out the kitchen window at the sky, which was still doing nothing visible and dramatic, which was the thing about this kind of storm, the thing the valley had taught people over generations, and that every generation managed to partially forget. The sky did not always warn you with its appearance. Sometimes the warning came from other things. From the way the cattle bunched. From the way the temperature dropped 2 degrees too fast in the late afternoon. From the way a barred owl moved from its post on the south fence to the north gate and sat there watching the low pass between the hills with an attention that had no ordinary explanation. He did not think about the owl. He thought about the grain storage, the equipment, the south field irrigation, the list of things that needed to be secured before a serious storm, and he began moving through that list with the focused efficiency of someone who has done emergency preparation before and knows the steps. What he did not immediately think about was that the lower field still had 2 of his irrigation pivots that he had left there that morning, and that retrieving them before the storm made practical sense, and that retrieving them himself meant going through the north gate and down the path between the hills in the late evening, on a night when the sky was about to do something that had not yet been decided. He thought of it at 7:41. He told Myra and Edna to stay in the house, told Edna to keep the radio on, told Myra not to worry, and went to get his truck. Myra watched him from the front window. She watched him drive to the north gate. She watched him get out of the truck to open the gate, stop for a moment, and then look at the fence post where the owl had been all day. The fence post was empty. The owl was gone. Myra did not know what that meant, but she felt it in the same place she felt everything she could not explain. In the center of her chest, in the spot that had been tender since her mother died, and that had never entirely stopped being tender. And what she felt, there was not warning anymore. What she felt, there was something closer to dread. She told Edna. Edna went to the window, looked out, watched Calloway's truck disappear through the north gate and down the path toward the lower field, and then picked up the phone to call him. He did not answer. The storm hit the valley at 8:14 p.m. Not gradually, not with the conventional sequence of darkening sky and rising wind that gives people time to finish the last thing they are doing and move to shelter. It hit the way storms hit the valley when the valley catches them rather than simply receives them, with a sudden totality that people who have experienced it once describe afterward as a wall, a curtain, a switch being thrown in the sky. The power went out in the farmhouse at 8:15. Edna had the flashlights. She had moved the emergency kit to the kitchen table 3 hours earlier, quietly, without explaining to Myra why, because she had not wanted to frighten her. Now she turned on a flashlight and called Calloway again, and listened to it ring without answering. And she felt in her own chest something she had not felt in many years, which was a specific kind of fear that is different from ordinary. Fear because it is about someone you love and about the particular helplessness of not knowing and not being able to reach them. Myra sat at the kitchen table in the white beam of the flashlight and did not cry. She was thinking about the owl, not about where it had gone, not about whether it'd come back, but about what it had done that day, the specific motion of its behavior, the way it had moved from south to north, the way it had stopped watching the house and started watching the path. She was 8 years old, and she could not have articulated what she was thinking in the way that an adult would articulate it, could not have said, "The owl showed me a direction, and then the owl removed itself from the equation, which means the direction is now my problem to do something about. She could not have said that, but she felt it, the way she felt most of the things that she could not explain, in the tender spot in the center of her chest. She told Edna she needed to go find her father. Edna said no. Mira looked at her grandmother with an expression that Edna would describe afterward to various people as the most serious expression she had ever seen on a child's face. Not frightened, serious, decided. She said, "The owl moved to the north gate because that's where Dad was going to go. It was watching the path because the path is the dangerous part. And now it's gone because someone has to go instead." Edna told her she was 8 years old. Mira said, "I know. But Dad is in the path, and no one else knows where he is." They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the beam of the flashlight while the storm hit the valley outside, while the windows flexed in the wind and the rain came against the glass so hard it sounded like gravel. And Edna thought about Leanne, who had also had a quality of serene certainty that could make you feel, when you were in the room with her, as though the ground were more solid than it actually was. And Edna thought about what Leanne would do right now if it were her, sitting at this table with a child who was looking at her like that. Leanne would have said, "Give her the other flashlight and put her coat on her." Edna stood up from the table. She took the second flashlight from the emergency kit. She helped Myra into her rain jacket and her boots. She pulled on her own coat and took the third flashlight, the big one, the one with the long beam, and she said, "We go together. We stay on the path. We call out every 30 seconds. We do not separate." Mira nodded. They went out into the storm. What Calloway remembered afterward, when he was asked to piece it together, was that the irrigation pivot on the lower field had taken longer than he expected to secure because one of the anchor bolts had stripped, and he had no replacement in the truck, and that by the time he had done what he could and started back up the path, the sky had changed in the way that valley skies can change when no one is watching them, with a speed that still surprised him, even though he had grown up here and had been surprised by it before. He remembered the rain starting. He remembered the path becoming difficult to see. He remembered that the stream that ran along the western side of the path between the hills was already running, higher than it should have been, which meant the drainage from the north ridge had started before the main storm, which meant the conditions in that narrow space between the hills were going to deteriorate faster than the open field. He had his phone. He had tried to call Edna, but the signal had dropped. He had his truck headlights, but the truck was parked at the bottom of the path, not at the top, and the path between was narrow and edged on one side by the swelling stream, and on the other by a slope that in heavy rain became unreliable in ways that were difficult to see in the dark. He was moving carefully. He was moving in the right direction. He was moving the way a person moves when they are not yet in serious trouble, but can feel the distance between not yet and already beginning to close. And then he went down. Not dramatically, not a fall that announced itself, but the ordinary, terrible fall that happens when your boot finds a wet root in the dark and your weight is already forward. The kind of fall that takes perhaps a second and a half from first slip to ground, and in which the entire sequence happens faster than thought, so that you are down before you have understood that you were falling. His left knee hit the edge of a rock. His flashlight went into the stream. He lay on the path for a moment in the dark and the rain and assessed. The knee was bad. Not broken, he thought, but bad, and the flashlight was gone. And the path was now completely dark, except for what the storm's own lightning occasional showed him in fragments. And the stream beside him was louder than it had been when he started up. He called out. His voice went into the storm, and the storm took it. He called again. This is the part of the story that Calloway would tell differently depending on who was asking. When he told it to strangers, he left some things out. When he told it to Edna, who had been there for part of it and did not need the parts she had witnessed explained to her. He told a version that was compressed and factual. When he told it to Mira, years later, when she was old enough that he felt she could hold the full weight of it, he told her all of it, including the part he had never told anyone else, which was about what happened while he was lying in the dark, on the path, waiting to hear something. Anything above the sound of the rain. He heard wings, not the wind. He knew the wind by that point. He had been listening to it for 20 minutes, and he knew its particular texture against the trees and the hill and the moving water. This was different. This was above him, and it was deliberate, and it was close. The soft percussion of something large landing on something nearby. And when the next flash of lightning came, and he turned his head toward the sound, he saw the outline of it on a branch that had fallen across the upper edge of the path. A large bird, a broad-shouldered silhouette with a round head, sitting perfectly still in the rain. The lightning was gone before he could be certain of what he was seeing. He told himself it was not what he thought it was. The bird made a sound, not the resonant, two-phrase call of a barred owl doing what barred owls do in the forest at night. A different sound, shorter, repeated twice. The kind of sound that, in the moment, he would only be able to describe as intentional, though he was aware, even as the word occurred to him, of everything problematic about applying that word to a bird. The sound came from the east side of the path, not the west side, where the stream was, where the path continued upward in a relatively straight line toward the gate. The east side, where there was a rougher, less obvious track that had once been used for hauling fence posts and had fallen out of use years ago, and that Calloway had not thought about in months, and that, crucially, climbed to the gate at a higher elevation than the main path, and therefore, on a night when the stream was rising and the main path's lower section was becoming uncertain, represented a significantly safer route. He lay in the dark and rain for a moment, thinking about what a person who did not believe in things ought to do with information delivered in this particular way. And he moved toward the east side of the path. Edna and Mira had been on the north path for 11 minutes when Mira stopped. The flashlight beams crossed each other in the rain, and the wet gravel of the path glittered in the light. And Edna stopped too, because Myra had stopped with the kind of sudden completeness that meant something. Not the pause of a child who has lost her footing, but the stop of someone who has heard or seen or felt something that requires processing. Myra pointed her flashlight up and to the right, off the main path, toward the rougher track that climbed toward the gate at the eastern edge. Something was moving up there. A figure, large, moving with the careful, deliberate gait of someone navigating difficult ground in the dark. Calloway, Edna, exhaled a sound that had no name in any language, the sound that belongs exclusively to the moment when someone you love reappears from the place where you had begun to imagine losing them. Mira ran, not fast, because the path was wet, and she had been told not to, but fast enough that her boots splashed and her flashlight beam bounced wildly against the rain and the hillside. And Calloway, on the upper path, heard the splashing and turned his own flashlight down and found her in the beam. He came down the last section carefully. He was limping. When he reached the main path, Myra wrapped both arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest, and Calloway put his hand on the back of her head, his rain-soaked hand on her rain-soaked hair, and held her there in the storm for a moment without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that would be adequate to the specific quality of this moment, to what it meant that she was here, and that he was here, and that they were both standing on the same piece of ground. Edna shone her flashlight at his face. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Can you walk?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then let's go home." They went back up the path toward the north gate, Mira between them, and the storm continued to move through the valley, and the valley caught it and held it the way it always did. But the three of them were on the path together, and they were moving toward the light in the farmhouse window that Edna had left on. The small warm square of the kitchen nightlight that ran on a separate battery circuit and had stayed on through the outage. And that light was the thing Calloway fixed his eyes on for. The entire walk back, the way a person fixes their eyes on the one reliable thing when everything else is uncertain. They did not talk about the owl that night. Calloway's knee needed attention, and Edna needed to manage that. And Myra sat at the kitchen table in dry clothes, with her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, and watched. The storm wind itself down outside the window, and nobody said the word owl out loud. And the space where the word should have gone was full of something that none of them had the energy to name. It was not until the following morning, when the storm had moved east and left the valley pale and wrecked and quiet, when the south field had standing water up to Calloway's knees and 2 sections of fencing were down, and the lower path was completely impassable where the stream had jumped its bank, that Calloway went out and stood at the north gate and looked at the fence post and the branch that crossed the upper path and the place where the east track began. He stood there for a long time. The branch where he had seen the silhouette was still there. He went and looked at it. The bark was thick with moisture, but not wet from rain, in the same way the ground around it was wet, which was not a fact that proved anything or could be made to prove anything, but was a fact nonetheless, the kind of small, specific detail that a person carries with them because it does not quite fit any of the available explanations, and so has no other place to go. He walked to the beginning of the east track and looked up it. Then he looked at the point on the main path where he had gone down, where the wet rock was still there, and the bank of the stream was undercut and eroded, and he understood that if he had continued on the main path in the dark, injured and without a light, the probability of a second fall was very high, and the probability of that second fall occurring near the undercut bank was also very high. And the stream by that point in the storm had been running fast enough and high enough that a man with a bad knee going into it in the dark would have been in serious trouble. He stood on the path by himself in the gray morning light, and he thought about his daughter. He thought about the 4 mornings she had watched the owl, the specific detail about the daylight perching that he had not registered and that Edna had registered, and that meant something to the people who knew what it meant. He thought about the morning. Mira had told him the owl had moved to the north gate, and the minute he had asked her to wait for while he finished his phone call, and how that minute had become 5. He thought about the patience with which she had kept trying to tell him something that he kept finding reasons not to hear. He thought about Leanne. He thought about what it means to dismiss a child's perception of the world on the grounds that the child is a child, and what it costs, and how much of what his daughter saw and understood every day he was probably not seeing and not understanding, not because it wasn't visible, but because he had decided, in the aftermath of a loss that had made meaning feel dangerous, that he would not look for meaning anymore. What that decision had cost him was almost incalculable. What it had nearly cost him was everything. Myra found him at the north gate an hour later. She had on her boots and her old gray sweater, and she was carrying 2 mugs of coffee, which was not something she had ever done before, the coffee being a habit she was too young for, and that had simply happened this morning without any explanation, as things sometimes simply happen in the aftermath of a night like the one they had survived. She handed him one of the mugs, and he took it without comment. The way you take something from someone when the gesture is clearly right, and the rightness of it makes commentary feel small. They stood at the gate together. The valley below them was changed, the stream brown with runoff, the lower path gone beneath standing water, the field marked by the storm's passage in the bent grasses, and the scattered debris of leaves and small branches. Mira looked at the fence post. She did not say anything about the owl. She did not point to the place where it had been, or ask where it had gone, or offer any explanation of the things that had happened on the path the night before, any of which would have been natural, and none of which she offered. She just looked at the fence post for a long moment, and then looked at the valley, and then looked at her father. She said, "I was scared last night." Calloway said, "I know." "I'm sorry," she said. "I tried to tell you." He said, "I know. I'm sorry for that too." This was not enough, as apologies go, not nearly enough for what the word sorry was being asked to carry in this moment. But Myra received it with a gravity and a completeness that made it feel like it was being heard by someone who understood the difference between what is said and what is meant, and was accepting both. She nodded. She looked back at the valley. He put his arm around her shoulders. They stood there for a while, at the north gate, in the morning light, with their coffee going cold in their hands, and the valley doing what the valley always did after a storm, which was continue. It took Calloway 3 months to understand what had changed in him. Not 3 months of dramatic reckoning, not 3 months of daily epiphany, but the quiet, gradual kind of change that happens when a person shifts their relationship to a belief they held so tightly that they stopped knowing they were holding it. The belief, in Calloway's case, was the one about meaning, about its unreliability, about the danger of trusting in connections that cannot be empirically verified. He had built that belief out of grief, had shaped it carefully, had lived inside it for 2 years. And it had done what beliefs built from grief often do, which was to protect him in the short term and quietly exclude him in the long term, keeping out not just the pain of false hope, but the quieter, steadier sustenance of being open to things he did not control and could not explain. He did not become a different person in those 3 months. He remained, in most respects, the same man he had been, practical and careful and prone to worrying about the south field. But he began to watch things differently. He began specifically to watch Myra differently, to pay attention when she pointed at something, or fell still, or came to him with something she had seen that she could not explain. He began to answer her with questions instead of dismissals, to treat her perceptions as data rather than decoration, to understand that his daughter occupied the world in a way that was different from the way he occupied it, not less accurate, not less real, but differently calibrated, attuned to registers that his own senses, narrowed by grief and pragmatism, had been unable to reach. He was not ready to call what the owl had done a warning. He was not ready to call it anything except what it was, which was something he did not understand, something that had happened in a particular sequence that had particular consequences, something that his daughter had perceived before it began, and that he had chosen at the time not to take seriously. He was ready now to not make that choice again. The owl never returned to the south fence post or the north gate or anywhere else on the property that any of them saw in the months and years that followed. Calloway asked around quietly, without making too much of it, the way a man who has decided not to ask too many questions about the things he cannot explain still sometimes needs to ask one question. He asked a naturalist he knew through the county extension office whether a barred owl could be expected to use a specific territory for 4 days and then abandon it completely. The naturalist said, it depends on why it was there. If the territory held something it needed and then didn't, then yes, departure would make sense. If it was there for another reason, the question of when it would leave would depend on when whatever that reason was had been resolved. Calloway sat with that answer for a long time. He never asked another question about it. There is a particular night that Myra has carried with her from childhood into everything that came after. Not the night of the storm, not the night of the path and the rain and the wings and the lightning, but the night 3 weeks later when she woke in the small hours and lay in her bed in the silence of the farmhouse and felt, for the first time since her mother died, that the tender place in the center of her chest was less tender than it had been, that something had shifted there, some small but real rearrangement of the weight she carried, as though the storm and what it had asked of her and what it had cost her had done something that grief alone could not do, which was show her what she was capable of when the thing she loved was in danger. She got up and went to the window. The fence post was empty, and the field was dark, and the valley was quiet in the way it was. Quiet between the events that defined it, between the storms it caught and held, resting in the ordinary time that always came after. She put her hand on the glass the way she had on the first morning, and stood there for a while, and the night outside was still and ordinary and entirely itself. That was enough. More than enough. That was the thing about the valley, and the thing about grief, and the thing about the particular calibration of a child who had learned to pay attention to things that could not be explained. The quiet between things was not the absence of meaning. The quiet was where meaning lived when it was not in motion. You had to learn to sit with it. You had to learn to wait. Mira had learned. In the years that followed, Mira Marsh became the kind of person who noticed things. Not in any extraordinary or dramatic way, not in any way that marked her as different from other people at first glance, but in the steady, reliable way of someone who had decided a long time ago to take seriously what she perceived even when no one else was taking it seriously yet. She became a wildlife biologist eventually, which surprised some people and surprised no one who had known her at 8 years old. She studied, among other things, the navigational and territorial behaviors of raptors, the ways in which birds of prey adapt their patterns in response to environmental changes, the question of what it means for an animal to be responding to stimuli that have not yet manifested in forms that human instruments can detect. She published several papers on the subject. In none of them did she mention the owl. But in the acknowledgement section of her first major paper, in the part where scientists thanked the people whose influence made their work possible, she wrote her father's name and next to it 3 words: for finally listening. Calloway read it in the farmhouse kitchen, at the same table where Edna had handed Mira a flashlight during the storm, and he set the paper down and looked out the window at the north gate and the fence post and the field beyond. And he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. There had been something to hear once, and he had not heard it. He heard it now. The owl was never seen in that valley again. But Myra never went to sleep without leaving the window open, just a little, just in case it needed to find its way back to her.